White male! White male! You're all white male! I've done nothing, I've done nothing.
On the 19th of November 2015, having failed in her earlier efforts to block approval for a parliamentary debate to mark International Men's Day, UK Member of Parliament Jess Phillip explained her objections to the event in the pages of the Independent newspaper. Phillips confirmed that she would not be participating in the debate because she had to look after her 2 children, and that whilst she commended her colleagues for approving a debate highlighting important issues like male suicide, she remained dubious about the notion of an International Day for Men for one very simple and apparently obvious reason. She then went on to propose the following: men are celebrated, elevated and awarded every day of the week, on every day of the year. Being a man is its own reward. You hit the jackpot when you are born a boy child. Yes, within your group things are tough for all sorts of reasons. You might be a poor man, a sick man, a marginalised gay minority ethnic man, but none of those reasons are because you are a man. On the surface it may seem unlikely, paradoxical even, that a mother of 2 young boys would take such an extremist and supremacist view on the absolute power and position of men in 21st century Britain. But there is in fact an entirely logical explanation as to why someone like Jess Phillip should be so in awe of men and so afraid of them. And it has to do with something that a lot of people, not least politicians, consider to be possibly the most valuable and sought after assets that can make the world of a difference to anyone concerned with playing the game of life. In a previous episode, I considered and hopefully effectively debunked a similarly sweeping proposal made by American writer John Scalzi. Scalzi had proposed that if life was a computer game, then men, and especially straight white men, get to play the game of life at the lowest difficulty setting there is. Now clearly such a notion oversimplifies an extremely complex reality, and no matter how well intentioned Scalzi's metaphor was, such perceptions also help to hide and even deny the truth of many men's experiences, and help to ensure that often little is known or done about men's particular needs until things reach breaking point. Just by way of example, in 2017, the UK's Higher Education Policy Institute released a report into the growing imbalance in educational achievement of boys, which came to some shocking conclusions. It outlined compelling evidence that boys are performing worse than girls across all levels of formal education, including apprenticeships, and led to the Chief Executive of University and College Admissions, or UCA, to suggest that if current trends continue, the gap between rich and poor will be eclipsed by the gap between males and females within a decade. Or to put it another way, if this differential growth carries on unchecked, then girls born on International Men's Day 2015 will be 75% more likely to go to university than people like Jess Phillips's 2 sons. As one education expert put it in the Times Higher Education supplement, imagine for a minute what would happen if these figures were reversed. I have no doubt that there would be panicked calls for an inquiry into what was causing such dramatic gender inequality. Now, some might consider this to be a quite remarkable blind spot, especially in the context of the current general direction of travel for gender equality narratives, popularly championed by public policy planners. But many people, including people like Jess Phillip and John Scalzi, actually believe that this is no mere matter of administrative oversight or public official malpractice, and that deliberate and nefarious forces are very much at play. And for people like Jess Phillip and John Scalzi, those forces even have a name. So, patriarchy can be defined as a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. Patriarchy allows males to hold primary power and predominate in roles of political leadership, moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. Possibly the most obvious example of patriarchal ordering can be seen in the common kinship system, where an individual's family membership derives from and is recorded through his or her father's lineage. Historically, the term patriarchy referred to autocratic rule by the male head of the family, but today it is more commonly understood to refer to systems of social stratification in which power is primarily held by men. And according to Wikipedia at least, patriarchy is pretty much everywhere, because even if their constitutions and laws don't explicitly say it so, most contemporary societies are in practice ordered along patriarchal lines. The distinguished sociologist Sylvia Walby has defined patriarchy as a system of social structures and practices in which men dominate, oppress, and exploit women. Whereas others argue, at least in contemporary Western countries like Great Britain, the notion that women are being structurally oppressed by the state is an increasingly unrealistic notion to hold. And that perhaps at best the patriarchy is a conspiracy theory as realistic as the Illuminati or the New World Order, and at worst it offers believers an external locus of control which can be used to blame for all the woes in the world and all of a person's personal problems as well. Now, the thing is that realistically speaking, no matter how thin you slice a matter, you always end up with two sides. And even then, the heart and truth of that matter still lies somewhere in between. But whether or not you personally believe that you live in a system where men dominate, oppress, and exploit women, a crucial shared problem we have with men is that an awful lot of people seem to sincerely believe that we do. And a significant proportion of those people are increasingly finding their way into extremely influential and powerful positions. So I want to, so to speak, lean into this particular conspiracy theory and consider how patriarchy hurts men too. And to do that most effectively, I want to return to John Scalzi's metaphor about the lowest difficulty setting there is, and consider physical evidence of patriarchal plotting that is very much hiding in plain sight. 4 months after Scalzi published his article, The Lowest Difficulty Setting There Is, the award-winning British artist Grayson Perry refined his metaphor about so-called white male privilege in his award-winning work on masculinity to describe a concept he called default man. Perry proposed that the very vast majority of people live in a physical world that is built almost entirely in someone else's image, and is very much based on that someone else's very particular perspectives, priorities, and values. And that someone else is the default male. They dominate the upper echelons of our society, imposing unconsciously or otherwise their values and preferences on the rest of the population. With their colourful textile phalluses hanging around their necks, they make up an overwhelming majority in government, in boardrooms, and also in the media. They are, of course, white, middle-class, heterosexual men, usually middle-aged. And every component of that description has historically played a part in making this tribe a group that punches far, far above its weight. Somehow his worldview, his take on society, now so overlaps with the dominant narrative that it is like a Death Star hiding behind the moon. We cannot unpick his thoughts and feelings from the proper right thinking attitudes of our society. We live and breathe in a default male world. No wonder he succeeds, for much of our society operates on his terms. Now, a crucial distinction between Scalzi and Grayson Perry's model of the dominant and world-defining default male is the number of people they see as actually in or out of the club. Scalzi invites a lot more people into the clubhouse, but Perry estimates that less than 10% of the UK population could realistically hope to make the grade, and that in global terms we're probably talking less than 1%, which means that while the very vast majority of members of let's call them the Manuminati, may very well, but not exclusively, be straight white men. Just like everybody else, the very vast majority of straight white men simply aren't in the club. To put that reality further into perspective, Grayson Perry himself, a straight white British man with a net worth of $5 million, reckons he's in the 99%. Grayson's portrait of default man helps to illustrate something forensic psychologist Dr. Helen Smith has defined as the apex fallacy, a fallacy which refers to judging groups primarily by the success or failure of those at the top. Smith applies this concept to perceptions of patriarchal power distribution, focused predominantly on prominent men at the very top of the pyramid. And the main problem with such a perspective is that it tends to place significantly less emphasis, and often largely ignore, a much bigger and entirely more statistically significant bigger picture hidden just below that apex. Significantly less emphasis on such realities as the relatively even distribution of the top 20% of highly paid professional jobs, which shows that in Western countries, equality of outcome has largely been achieved at this level. Such perspectives also often almost entirely ignore the infinitely larger population of both men and women in the bottom 80% of the pyramids, where occupational segregation remains significantly much more prominent and involves a significantly much larger proportion of straight white men, working long hours in unpopular, dirty, and often dangerous glass cellar or dad professions that are entirely necessary to feed our families, keep the wheels of industry spinning, and even quite literally keep the lights on. According to the Bureau of Labour Statistics in the so-called Land of the Free, less than 1% of America's boilermakers, brickmasons, septic tank servicing operatives, sewer pipe cleaners and trash collectors happen to be women. And the mostly men in such professions may, on average, receive higher rates of pay than peers in their part of the pyramids who work in disproportionately female occupations. But they will also generally work on average 20% longer hours in comparatively dangerous and sometimes extremely unpleasant conditions. A harsh reality underlined by the fact that approximately 78% of all workplace injuries and 97% of all workplace deaths are experienced by men. Men and boys are very sadly and increasingly bombarded with a narrative and rhetoric implying that not only are they the privileged sex who hit the jackpot when they were born and get to play the game of life at the lowest difficulty setting there is, but that they are also somehow vicariously responsible for the historical, systemic and ongoing oppression and exploitation of every single woman and girl. But many men, particularly younger men, increasingly struggle with this perception of the world, with inevitable and sadly tragic implications for the well-being of society as a whole. The Samaritan's 2012 report on men, suicide and society suggested that buffer generations of men have struggled to cope with decades of social progress and changing, often conflicting perceptions, messages and beliefs about masculinity and men's role in society. Women in Great Britain now, on average, earn 7% more than men until well past the age of 30. Women without children now earn more than men without children throughout their career lifetime. For the past decade, men have consistently experienced higher rates of unemployment than women and are also significantly more likely to face long-term unemployment and significantly less likely to progress to third-level education. Meanwhile, the UK charity CAM, the Campaign Against Living Miserably, report that fears about job security, redundancy, unemployment and benefit cuts are key issues raised by male service users with suicidal thoughts, who attach a much greater importance on income and job status and often view it as central to their appeal to the opposite sex. And the Samaritans reports that men from the lowest social class living in the most deprived areas are up to 10 times more likely to die by suicide. And so if patriarchy really does exist, then it really hurts men too. Because as American academic Christina Hoff Sommers once shrewdly observed, if it's fair to class men in the role of oppressor, then men have to be the only oppressor class in history who are less educated, more victimized, and have shorter lives than those they oppress. They must be the only oppressor class who have claimed society's gritty, dangerous jobs as their exclusive preserve.
This is a trope that people just accept. Western society is a male-dominated patriarchy. It's like, no, it's not. That's not true. And even if it has a patriarchal structure to some degree, the fundamental basis of that structure is not power, it's competence. That's why our society works. It's only when a structure degenerates into tyranny that the fundamental relationships between people become dependent on power. It's not power. If you hire a plumber who's likely to be male, it's not because there's roving bands of tyrannical plumbers forcing you to make that choice. And it's the case with almost every interaction that you have at the face of our culture. You're dealing with people who are offering a service of one form or another, who are usually part of the broad middle class, and who offer, and what you're looking for is the person who can offer the best service, and you can find it. It's not a consequence of being dominated by anything that's tyrannical. And then again, our culture, our Western culture, which is by no means perfect, and certainly has tyrannical elements, like all cultures do, is the least tyrannical society that's ever been produced, and certainly the least tyrannical society that exists now. So where's the patriarchy exactly? So like this whole patriarchy thing, I think you have no idea how pernicious and dangerous it is.
Well, no, I don't. I really don't. Go on.
Throughout history have fundamentally cooperated to push back against the absolute catastrophe of existence. A terrible death rate, the probability of chronic starvation, early death, disease, the difficulty of raising children with all the death that was associated with that, and to look backwards in time and say, well, basically what happened was men took the upper hand and persecuted women in this tyrannical patriarchy. It's absolutely dreadful misreading of history. It's a terrible thing to teach young women, and it's a horrible thing to inflict upon men.
The most common criticism that John Scalzi received in the aftermath of his article about the lowest difficulty setting there is was the fact that his model of so-called patriarchal privilege entirely ignores statistically significant and vital variables to life outcomes, such as wealth or socioeconomic status at birth, and physical or mental health. Predictably enough, John dismissed such notions by arguing that such variables were not fixed or immutable in the way that sex is, and pointed to the example of his own experience, which had involved growing up in poverty and in a single-parent household. Now, obviously, while I'm sure everyone is delighted to hear that John is well and truly living the American dream, but given the number of people born every year with a physical or learning disability, the majority of whom are boys by the way, all I'll say is that perhaps he should review his understanding of the word immutable. And if you really hit the jackpots when you're born a boy child, as at least one member of the UK Parliament seems to sincerely believe, why is it that baby boys have higher infant mortality rates than baby girls pretty much wherever in the world they start playing the game of life at the lowest difficulty setting there is? Why are baby boys biologically more vulnerable to infections and conditions, which can also lead to lifelong health implications arising from premature birth? And why is it that so many of them have their genitals cut before they've even learnt to say the word no? And so, if patriarchy is about a certain class of people holding primary power, predominating in political leadership, privilege, property and moral authority, all the while oppressing and exploiting everyone else, then for over half a century, in Great Britain at least, it's fair to argue that a woman has been the head of the firm. A firm whose system of structures of control and oppression certainly aren't exclusively in the charge of men, which I suppose could make Jess Phillip an actual agent of patriarchy, especially if the game they're playing is divide and rule. Either that, or maybe she's just a useful idiot, unwittingly but very helpfully championing their cause.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.